In police crime museums all over Europe, there are items of evidence that have brought some of the world's worst criminals to justice. Behind every object in these black museums is a fascinating and sometimes macabre story. It's true to say that with the advances of science, the work of forensic experts in helping to solve crime has become ever more specialized. Forensic dentistry, or odontology, is now accepted as an essential part of the forensic sciences. In our first case, one of the most shocking of its day, it was the dental evidence that finally nailed the murderer. As his trial in 1949 would expose, John George Haigh was a callous killer whose motivation was always money and whose victims were always those he called his friends. In February of 1949, Haigh's gaze fastened on the woman who was to become his sixth victim. With cold calculation, he premeditated not only her death, but also a foolproof plan to defy detection. He had known Mrs. Durrant Deacon, a fellow resident at the Onslow Court Hotel in London, for 4 years. He had charmed her and the other elderly guests with his suave appearance, attentiveness, and apparent prosperity.
I remember him as a very smart person. He always gave me the impression that he was very important and a gentleman. My father used to do jobs for him in the workshop. He was always very kind and friendly towards me, and you know, as a young lad running around his place, he might have been otherwise.
He was charming, very friendly, easy to talk to, quietly spoken, very pleasant.
Haigh was deep in debt, and Mrs. Durrant Deacon, with her expensive clothes and jewellery, became the means by which he sought to escape his creditors. This cheque, which Haigh wrote out for the sum of £45, well, it bounced. The date on the cheque is just a week before he set his dreadful plan in motion. Having chatted to Mrs. Durrant Deacon about a joint business venture, producing false fingernails, he arranged to take her to his factory in Crawley, 30 miles south of London, that Friday the 18th of February. They were to look at a possible method of manufacture. How could you have imagined what Haigh was really planning? The next day, Saturday, there was some concern at the Onslow Court Hotel that Mrs. Durrant Deacon had not returned. By the Sunday, her friend Constance Lane and the hotel staff were very worried indeed. Ever the considerate resident, Haigh suggested that they should inform the police, and he drove Miss Lane to the local station to make a statement. Haigh was not the first villain to act in such an overconfident manner. He had killed before and had never been caught. Perhaps he thought he was invincible.
Initially, it was one of the oldest tools of criminal investigation, human intuition, which should never be overlooked, that played a major role. The woman police officer, Alexandra Lambourne, had listened to the report about the missing friend. She felt uneasy about Haigh, and when it came out that Miss Durrant Deacon had told Miss Lane that she was visiting Haigh's workshop, Haigh replied she did not turn up.
On a hunch, the policewoman ran a check on Haigh, which revealed that he'd been in prison several times for fraud, looting, and selling stolen goods. The police began to take an interest in Haigh. With still no sign of Mrs. Durrant Deacon, they visited the Onslow Court Hotel, and on learning that he had just paid off his large outstanding bill there, they decided to take a look at his so-called factory in Crawley. On the 26th of February, the police searched Haigh's workshop, and several items caught their attention. 2 large carboys containing acid stood in the middle of the floor. A rubber apron hung on the wall, and on a workbench sat an army-type respirator, along with a leather hat box and a briefcase. These last items the police took away for examination. Among the papers in the briefcase was a dry cleaning receipt. When officers visited the cleaners, they were handed a fur coat, which they were told had been brought in by a dapper gentleman. It was identical to the one Mrs. Durrant Deacon was wearing when she disappeared. The hat box contained a revolver. Haigh was taken into custody and questioned about Mrs. Durrant Deacon's disappearance. At first, he repeated his earlier version of events.
But when confronted by the receipt for the fur coat, Haigh fell silent. Then, in a manner described by one of the detectives as cheerful, he announced, "If I told you the truth, you wouldn't believe it. It's too fantastic for belief. Mrs. Durrant Deacon no longer exists. She's disappeared completely, and no trace of her can ever be found again. I've destroyed her with acid. How can you prove a murder without a body?" To say that the police were shocked at Haigh's words would be an understatement, but Haigh was wrong on two counts. Firstly, the Crown has to prove a crime, not produce a body. And secondly, Mrs. Durrant Deacon hadn't disappeared, at least not completely.
Despite this confession, police still had to prove that a murder had indeed taken place, and that Mrs. Durrant Deacon was the victim, and that Haigh was the murderer. After this dramatic opening, they took down a full confession.
He told them that Mrs. Durrant Deacon had gone with him to the workshop in Crawley, and while she was looking at some pieces of plastic, he had shot her in the back of the head with a .38 revolver. Having removed her coat and jewellery, he manoeuvred her body into a 40-gallon steel drum, which, wearing his protective outfit of apron, gloves and mask, he later pumped full of neat sulfuric acid.
During these endeavours, Haigh had popped over the road to a cafe for a poached egg and a pot of tea. He then returned to the workshop to observe the chemical reaction taking place in the oil drum.
Over the next couple of days, he visited the workshop several times to check on the state of his victim and to top up the acid bath. Between visits, he sold off Mrs. Durrant Deacon's jewellery and took her coat to the cleaners. When he found the contents of the drum to his liking, he tipped what remained onto the ground outside his workshop. Mrs. Durrant Deacon was now, he boasted, a mess of sludge. At this point, one of the outstanding characters of forensic medicine was called in. Keith Simpson was then a young pathologist, but his work on what became known as the acid bath murder would become legendary.
Keith Simpson, whom I knew increasingly well over the years, was the doyen of pathologists of his time. Meticulous in the examination and the collection of evidence, he presented his findings in court impeccably and was seldom the subject of a successful confrontation. He knew well the difficulties of a medical witness in cross-examination, and he took every step to see that his case was sound.
Entering Haigh's workshop, Simpson noticed finely scattered red spots above the workbench. The stains were photographed, and then the areas of plaster were carefully removed for analysis. Then, with characteristic flair, he spotted outside the workshop what looked like several small pebbles. About the size of a cherry, they had polished facets. Simpson suspected, quite rightly, that they were human gallstones.
This was a marvellous piece of detective work. It so happens that women of Mrs. Durrant Deacon's age can develop gallstones during life. And he may well have suspected that that was so, and he was proved right.
Simpson also identified bones that would prove to be part of a left foot, and from the sludge he pulled out a hairpin. These were significant discoveries, but Simpson felt sure that the mass of sludge would yield many more. An area of 6 feet by 4 feet of the greasy matter was taken to the Metropolitan Police Laboratory, packed in wooden boxes. Over the next 3 days, Simpson isolated about 28 pounds of yellow grease, which was identified as animal fat. 2 more human gallstones were extracted, and about 18 pieces of bone. Simpson was able to identify a pelvic bone, which was clearly female. The top of a red plastic handbag was pulled out, as well as the metal cap of a lipstick case. But most important of all was Simpson's final discovery. Deep within the sludge, he found a set of dentures, fully intact. Using forensic dentistry, they would be able to positively identify the remains.
Forensic odontology, forensic dentistry, is that part of forensic medicine which deals with the correct handling of dental evidence, its presentation in court in the interest of justice. The hard dental tissues are the least destructible of the human body, and they can withstand insult by immersion, mutilation and fire. And as such, in the first instance, we rely on knowing the arrangement of the teeth. Everybody's dentition is characteristic of the individual, and as such, if recovered, can be matched up against either the physical known features of a person or against the treatment that that person has had in life.
Mrs. Durrant Deacon's dentist was approached. She had treated her for more than 20 years. During that time she had made her at least 5 sets of dentures. When presented with those extracted from the sludge, she was able to confirm without hesitation that she had fitted her with this set in 1947.
Ever since Haigh had made his confession, medical and scientific experts were dubious that sulfuric acid would completely destroy a body. A number of experiments were carried out to clear up the matter.
A sulfuric acid bath acts by extracting water from the tissues, generating a great heat. Tests showed that an amputated foot dissolved completely in 4 hours, a sheep's leg in 4 days. The bones dissolved, but fat was resistant even to such hot acid. Mrs. Durrant Deacon had been a plump lady, and it was the large amount of body fat that had preserved the few remains. A month later, nothing would have been left. Even the acrylic resin dentures would have disintegrated completely if Haigh had left them longer in the acid.
I leant out the window just as the train was pulling out and asked for a paper, and there he was, right on the front page. I just sat down and couldn't believe it was the same man.
Haigh claimed that he had committed a good many more murders, 5 of which the investigators accepted as true. The rest, well, he believed that the more murders that he could claim, the more likely it was that he would end his days naturally in an asylum rather than suddenly in an execution chamber. At his trial, Haigh did indeed plead insanity and spent much of the time feigning indifference to the proceedings by doing crossword puzzles. He said that with all of his murders he experienced a lust for blood and drank a full glass from each of his victims.
The jury were not persuaded by his talk of vampirism. Perhaps they recalled that either just before or just after he was supposed to have quenched his thirst with a glass of Mrs. Durrant Deacon's blood, he had popped out for a poached egg and a pot of tea, a combined snack menu that would have made even Dracula turn green.
Haigh sat for many hours behind this cell door while the gruesome details of his crimes were outlined. His foolproof plan had proved anything but. Because of her false teeth, the remains of Mrs. Durrant Deacon were positively identified. And after a trial lasting only a couple of days, the jury needed a mere 13 minutes to decide that Haigh was sane and guilty as charged. On Wednesday, the 10th of August 1949, Haigh was executed by hanging.
Haigh had gone to such great lengths to destroy the human body, but hadn't had any idea that the acid would not dissolve away the plastic dentures. And of course the dentures being readily identifiable by the dentist, one could prove who the victim was. All forensic odontologists hope to achieve a positive identification, and this is certainly a landmark case.